Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, social marketers around the world. My name is Win Morgan, and as president of the International Social Marketing Association, it's both my privilege and my pleasure to introduce the 13th in a series of webinars designed to advance social marketing teaching, research, and practice. Our moderators for today and organizers are Jay Kassir and Tamara Harbour. We'll begin in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like to remind you of some member benefits features that are provided through the International Social Marketing Association. The first one I want you to know about is that if you are a member of ISMA, you get a full year access to all of our archives of our webinars, this being our 13th, so you'd have all 13, plus all future webinars for the next year, all for the price of one webinar. So we do encourage you, if you haven't joined yet, to join today and give yourself a treat for the next year. You also get a 20% discount on the Social Marketing Quarterly. Members can now subscribe to the Journal at a savings. You can subscribe at https://smq.html. And that's for members. And we want to thank Ryan Holm for that, who's been helping us with that journal discount. And I see Ryan is also on the line with us today. So thanks, Ryan. Now I'd like to turn over the webinar to our moderators, Jay Kassir and Tamara Harbour. Jay, over to you.
Thanks, Win, and welcome everyone. I want to remind you that if there's more than one of you at your location, we would appreciate it if you would let us know how many you are using the chat box. Also, please do ask questions using the text box as they come to you. Don't wait until the end of the talk. We'll answer your questions at the end in roughly the same order as they came in during the webinar. Now we should have here a poll for you so that we can find out how you found out about today's webinar. We'd appreciate if you'd go ahead and answer in here.
Jay, can we click all that apply? I think so.
There is no all that apply. You can do multiple ones, I believe.
Right, I can click more than one then.
Yeah, you can, exactly. You can click more than one. And I see a fair number of people now have put their information in. So just go ahead and we'll skip to the results. And this is great to see colleagues recommending it to other colleagues. Glad to see a large number of those. Thank you. Glad to see that our email are getting to you and that the website is being helpful. Great. Okay. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to pass the baton over to Tamara, who will introduce our speaker, Christine Domegan.
Okay. Thanks, Jay. And just before I do introduce Christine, to remember, as you're seeing on the screen, please enter any questions you have as they come to you during the presentation into the chat box, and then they will be answered in roughly the same order in which the questions have come in at the end of the presentation. So go ahead and do that. And I will now introduce our speaker, Dr. Christine Domegan. She's speaking to us today from Ireland, specifically from National University of Ireland in Galway. As head of marketing and senior lecturer in marketing, she teaches social marketing and works with students from the undergraduate to the PhD level. She's also active with the Whitaker Institute, where she is the research cluster leader for social innovation and policy. Her focus there is on applying social marketing to behavioral and systems change and social innovation. Christine is the European editor for the Journal of Social Marketing, and her own publications can be found in various social marketing journals, including the Sage Handbook of Social Marketing. If you're interested in reading her work, you could look up the book she's co-authored titled Social Marketing From Tunes to Symphonies, which is now in its second edition. Although some of her current EU and nationally funded research work embraces health issues, today she'll be speaking about another exciting environmental project she's been closely involved with, the Seed for Society initiative. We'll be hearing about how individual behavior change can be connected to far-reaching social change. Christine, thank you very much for being here with us today. I know we're all looking forward to hearing about the behind-the-scenes inner workings of the C for Society initiative and how it's been going. So, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tamara. And like Win, Jay, and Tamara, everyone, I'd like to welcome you. So thank you very much for joining us. And in the tradition that we have here in Ireland, it's Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes to this Advances in Social Marketing and C for Society session. We're delighted you can join us, and I do hope that you get to take away a few social marketing insights that are valuable and helpful to you in your work. Today's session, C for Society, is about looking at social marketing and how we can link individual behavioral change to social transformation that potentially has impact, scale, and sustainability. So our starting point is very much with social marketing itself. And we're seeing a lot of discussion among practitioners and scholars alike as to social marketing and the challenges that it faces and how to grapple with creating long-lasting change. All of this is really about a broadening and deepening of social marketing. So can you think of any ideas or examples that you might be seeing in your own social marketing work that reflects this broadening and deepening? Here's some that you've probably come across. The very first one, it's a classic one, comes to us from smoking. We very much think about smoking, tobacco controls. It's about adults giving up cigarettes. And in more recent years, there's been targeting of adolescents, asking them to give up smoking, or better still, to not even start smoking. But the latest development in the smoking arena comes from a market innovation to do with e-cigarettes. Essentially, another smoking product variation to be seen as harmful and as damaging as their traditional market offering, and to be tackled by social marketers as well. If we turn our attention to obesity, we see the same ramping up of social problems. In the early 70s, we would have been concerned as social marketers with overweight people. By the 80s and 90s, our attention as social marketers had rapidly turned to obese and morbidly obese adults, captured here in this example before you by the growing portion sizes. And now, 21st century social marketers, together with health professionals and policymakers, are particularly concerned about children and childhood obesity. And we may have reached a point in time where children will not live as long or have as long a life expectancy as their parents. And of course, it isn't just in health that we're seeing this escalation of problems and issues facing society. If we turn to the environment, we're seeing similar patterns of expansion there. Just look at recycling, and we see market and consumer evolutions that have accelerated the issues social marketers deal with. And it's captured by the now familiar strapline: reduce, reuse, and recycle. All different facets of essentially waste management and pollution control. Our last example that might have crossed your mind comes from alcohol. Traditionally, when we think of alcohol, we associate alcohol with young people, binge drinking, and maybe college students. If you add driving to that cocktail, then that brings you into road safety and drink driving campaigns. But the more recent manifestation to do with alcohol and binge drinking has nothing to do with young people, and it's more associated with older segments. So now you have binge drinking, alcohol poisoning, as you see in over 30s, and the stay-at-home over 50, 55 segments. So really, whether it's these classic social marketing examples of tobacco, obesity, waste, or whether you're working in the areas of climate change and marine conservation, there is consensus emerging from social marketers around the world that we are facing evolving, complex, and wicked social problems. So here's our first takeaway message for today, or a critical reflection point if you'd prefer. The broadening and deepening of social marketing says two things to us. Simple social ills escalate into complex and wicked societal problems, as we've seen from these few examples, and I've no doubt you're seeing in your own work. And as a result of that, social marketing inherently has two fundamental change states that it needs to operate or work at. The first of these change states can be considered like a rocking horse. It's akin to a rocking horse. We can go to the Bank of England and its chief economist, Andy Alden, who explains, the dominant paradigm that underlies most of our societies is all about neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics assumes that markets and its associated products are narrow and mechanistic in the way they work. They're predictable. So this kind of prime directive also assumes that consumers are rational. So a bit like a rocking horse, markets and consumers, when they're moved by outside forces, they'll sway and move in a predictable, straightforward manner for a little while. And then they settle back into a more static or normal or business as usual state. When we apply this to social marketing, we get what we call rocking horse social marketing, the social marketing that you and I are most familiar with. And it's the typical social marketing that we've seen for about the past 40 years. So how would we describe it? Well, we would say that it's about behavioral change. Traditionally, this behavioral change is focused at the individual, so it's in individual behavioral change or downstream social marketing. You'll see some people use the word micro-level change as well. It makes very good use of the 4 Ps, the marketing mix that you and I love: product, price, place, and promotion. I would say to you that it's Cotlerian in nature, tone and approach. It's about micromanagerial social marketing, excellent social marketing, and excellent intervention aimed at one target audience or one group. And it's what a lot of authors would call first order change. And by first order change, what we're looking at there are the symptoms of a problem and responding to fixable, immediate, and visible causes. There is another form of social marketing emerging, and it's the second fundamental state of social marketing that's akin to wild horses. So horses, we know, are herd animals. They depend upon each other for their very survival. It only takes one horse to kick, and more often than not, another one will spook, and within a second, a whole herd have taken off. Their flight path is unpredictable and constantly altering, responding to whatever it's in their way. Sometimes they're jumping obstacles, other times they're adjusting direction, learning from each other, and altering their speed. If we apply this kind of thinking to social marketing, we see that it's about social or systemic change. It's characterized by an environment that's full of diversity and complexity, that's open and non-linear and dynamic. Dynamic markets, dynamic marketing and consumers, constantly altering, responding, shaping, and modifying each other. This kind of emerging social marketing looks at interventions at all different levels at the same time. So it takes the notion of our rocking horse social marketing and has rocking horses at micro, meso, and macro levels. It's about a bottom-up and top-down approach to change. It moves beyond once off individual level change and looks to interagency partnerships and social learning. It's very much an ecosystem view of change. It uses the 4 Ps of Rocking Horse social marketing, but it also augments them. So you may find policy and partnerships added as 2 further Ps, and we're seeing evidence here in Europe of participation and processes also being important. Some people refer to this as second order change. And it's like where all social marketing interventions can be considered and placed in a marketing system. And the focus is on the exchange and the intricacies of understanding exchange from a social systems perspective. To capture this notion of rocking and wild horse social marketing, we're seeing new terminology emerge. And here's some examples before you. Macro social marketing, system social marketing, strategic social marketing. And here are some of the authors that are developing these terms and concepts and questioning the tools and techniques that are relevant to these types of social marketing. So what about you? Which of these broadened social marketing approaches, if any, are you experiencing in your own work? Are you moving into macro or systems or social change? Put another way, are you managing projects where connecting individual behavioral change to far-reaching social innovation is really what's needed? Well, if you answered yes, then you have a sense of what C for Society is about. C for Society is a European-funded project under the 7th framework, and it's a mobilization and mutual learning action plan within our Science and Society umbrella. It involves over 28 partner organizations across 21 different countries. And the project brings together researchers, marine and land-based organizations, government, non-government agencies, individuals, citizens, and youth in a joint action program, all aimed at laying the foundation of a blue society, a society where humankind lives in harmony with the sea and ocean. And you might ask why? Why invest in a blue society? There are numerous different reasons. Mankind depends upon the ocean and its marine resources for its very survival. And some statistics, 71% of our planet's surface and 97% covered by water. More importantly, every second breath you and I take comes from the ocean. So healthy oceans equals healthy humans and healthy societies. And that's what this project is about. To try and begin this process of grappling with a blue society and moving towards it and what it might look like and the types of changes that are needed to bring it about, there are 2 aspects to C for Society and its Rocking Horse, Wild Horses approach. The first is a consultation phase that's to inform, shape, and influence the second phase. And the second phase is about mobilization, about movement, interventions, actions, and campaigns. So we'll deal with the first phase, which is consultation. And you see here some of the reasoning behind this. C for Society begins by recognizing that we are dealing with a very complex problem. So we're dealing with wild horses as well as our rocking horses. Multiply that by the number of countries and cultures that are involved, and the complexity starts to overwhelm you. So we believe that it's very important for social marketers to facilitate joint actions by working with a variety of stakeholders across and between sectors, communities, network, and countries. What's also important to this consultation phase is research with societal stakeholders into the description and the design of the problems, solutions, and policies if we're to make societal progress. Remember, up to this, a lot of the stakeholders involved were marine experts, but now we want to expand that, move outside the marine domain and bring in people from health and from transport and from energy and from where you live. Because we also want to build capacity. We want to build in sustainability and legacy by helping groups to develop outcomes that integrate contributions from individuals who have very different, diverse views, backgrounds, and perspectives. So that brings us then to methodology and a consultation methodology that can deliver. Traditionally, you might look to focus groups. More recently, World Cafes come to mind as well. But for this project, the answer for us lay in collective intelligence. So our chosen methodology is a group methodology. It's also known as interactive management, developed by Warfield back in the 70s, and chosen because its theoretical basis is in systems science and sophisticated problem-solving techniques for complex problems. Collective intelligence is a facilitation process, and it allows group to look at barriers to a sustainable marine ecosystem. It allows groups, or in this case stakeholders, to discuss, identify, debate and question how these barriers are interrelated and connected. But it goes one step further as well as looking at barriers. It draws upon the expertise and the knowledge that's already there and asks stakeholders to think about and reveal feasible and impactful options for a sustainable marine ecosystem. So it's particularly good at connecting these diverse views and experiences and knowledge among very different stakeholders. And that diversity can then be linked and aligned to benefits that are perceived by citizens and youth. So collective intelligence as an approach carefully separates out content and process roles. The participants, in this case stakeholders and citizens, they're responsible for contributing ideas. And the facilitator is responsible for choosing and implementing tools and techniques to generate, clarify, structure, interpret, and amend ideas. So collective intelligence consists of 5 elements. You have the participant group, you have consensus methodologies, there's supporting computer software, you have the human factor, a facilitator, and you also need an environment that's very conducive to serious, constructive conversation. So you need to have a physical space that's very comfortable for a group of people to come together and talk through in detail over time the issues that they're trying to grapple with. And in many cases, these conversations are going to hit some rocky patches where there's going to be tension and differences of view as well. So if we look at collective intelligence then and the actual doing of it, we find that there are 4 stages, particularly in this case for the stakeholders. So stakeholders went through idea generation, idea categorization, structuring of the barriers, and generating options then. It all starts with a trigger question. So the trigger question for stakeholders was, what are the barriers to a sustainable marine ecosystem in relation to? And because of the size of this project, we were very fortunate because we were able to deal with a number of different themes, such as human health, energy, transport, a place to live, leisure and tourism. So you can look at the barriers to a sustainable marine ecosystem according to a number of different topics. So you begin with your trigger questions, and the stakeholders take their time to generate what they perceive to be barriers, first of all individually, and then they share with each other. That done, They then start to rank order the barriers that they're seeing. Moving on to the second stage, which is idea categorization, the stakeholders used paired comparison. And there's a collective engagement there to create categories of common barriers. Now what's important here is the conversation, because the stakeholders have to listen to each other and question their understanding of the barriers presented. Once they've reached that point, a voting process can take place, and the stakeholders can identify the most important barriers within each of the categories. So far, idea generation and idea categorization has taken us a day. So it gives you a sense of the detail that's in the discussion. We move on to stage 3, which is the structuring barriers. The barriers that received the highest votes are then entered into the computer software, and they get put through a series of relational questions. So the stakeholders have to ask, does barrier A significantly aggravate barrier B? So does a lack of knowledge about marine resources significantly aggravate your attitude towards conservation? Yes, no vote is taken, and that's entered into the software until all of the relational barriers have been explored. To bring collective intelligence to a conclusion, the last part of the second day was spent on generating options. And here stakeholders looked at the barrier categories that they generated, and they proposed solutions to overcome those barriers. The facilitation question at that point was, what are the options for overcoming the barriers in, for example, human health? And having discussed what those options might be and listened to other stakeholders and their perception of those options, they then went on to vote on the proposed solutions. Importantly, those proposed solutions had to be the most feasible, impactful, and timely in each of the categories. If we move on to our citizens, we see the citizens went through a similar collective intelligence process, but there were a few differences. The citizens in use in this case, we defined them as 18 to 25-year-olds. In particular, they had no expertise or professional knowledge of the sea. So we were looking for people who would have been classified or considered uninformed. These are people who were not members of an aquarium or a science museum. And instead of 2 days, they went through a 1-day collective intelligence process. And that 1 day had 2 steps to it: idea generation and further contributions. Similar to the stakeholders, they had a trigger question. In this case, what contributions do the sea and its resources make to your daily life? And after silent generation of contributions and then discussing and sharing them, the citizens went through the second round, looking at further contributions they might like to see, they might anticipate, or they might envisage maybe next year or the year afterwards. So what do the numbers look like? What kind of results emerged from this collective intelligence process? Well, if we look at our stakeholders, we had 249 stakeholders participate in consultations in 8 different countries. Between them, they generated 774 individual barriers to a sustainable marine ecosystem. And associated with those barriers, they generated 653 options that they perceived to be feasible and impactful. If we look at our citizens and youths, we had 288 citizen youths involved in consultations from 8 different countries, and they generated 858 benefits that they were experiencing from the sea in their daily lives. And associated with that, they saw 832 further contributions that might be made to their lives going forward. So what do you do with all of this barrier data? And how can this barrier data help you in terms of rocking horse or wild horse social marketing? Well, the first thing that you have to do is start making more sense of that data. So along with the 774 stakeholder barriers, we were also, as a result of the structuring phase, able to generate what we call structural maps. In this case, we've got 16 C for Society country structural maps. And these structural maps depict and capture the stakeholders' perceptions of how the barriers are interrelated and how the barriers are connected. So a unique output from collective intelligence is this very rich and informative understanding of stakeholders' views, which can be used then as a strong basis for designing and legitimizing any mobilization activities that follow. And to give you a sense of what a structural map looks like, here's one taken from Ireland. And the theme in question for this one was a place to live. So if we have a look at the diagram in front, the first thing to note is that you read it from left going to the right. So we're saying that the barriers here on the left, that these barriers significantly aggravate all of the remaining barriers to the right. And the next thing then is to have a look at this box itself. This one here that has 3 different barriers in it. These are lack of vision by policymakers towards the sea, there's sea blindness, and lack of a marine department. And these 3 barriers are aggravating each other. So the lack of vision by policymakers is aggravating the sea blindness that stakeholders perceive. And the sea blindness is also aggravating the fact that we don't have a marine department. The other thing to note with your structural barrier are the different pathways of aggravation. And if you count up these pathways, you start to see here's one pathway, here's a second pathway of aggravation, here's a third way. In total, we had 6 different pathways of aggravation, capturing the tension and difficulties and conflicts that the stakeholders perceive. This graphical representation, the structural map in front of you, is the most tangible output from collective intelligence. But there was also a lot of other qualitative data that was captured through video recordings, etc. And some of that goes to the physical space, just having time out, time away from the busyness of your life. Where one of the stakeholders says, to be honest, the group of people present here, they were so diverse and they represented so many different interests. In any other context, it would have been all-out war. But as it was, we were able to discover our common goals and interests and work constructively together. So that's the first part of the data. We can do a little bit more with these individual barrier statements. Valuable and all as our individual statements are and our individual country maps. Remember, we're looking at mobilization at an EU level as well. So we move into thematic analysis. So this is where all 774 barriers, get put through a coding machine by 6 interdisciplinary coders. This involved reading and rereading every single barrier. There's constant comparison of the data using open coding and focus coding, where you are looking for the commonalities and differences. And eventually, after quite a number of weeks of work, we get to a point where we have 38 C for Society categories that capture all of the individual barriers. Here's an example of the actual meta-analysis as it's happening. And you will see here, see around here, this is the category, one of the categories. It turns out to be the second highest voted category, and it has to do with conflict. So you're seeing conflict of interest, conflict between different users, conflict of policies, conflict of uses there. And that process keeps going to help you move towards this higher level view. So the final bit of analysis or thematic analysis turns to the literature. And we look at the science communication, mobilization, environmental literature to synthesize the data further and identify higher order themes that could talk to mobilization at a European level. So what did that data look like? What kind of story starts to emerge? For effective mobilization to be put into place and move towards a blue society. So here we're saying, okay, what are we learning? What can we mobilize on? And that brings us to a point where we start to score each of the barriers, each of the individual barriers. So remember, so far these barriers have been telling us about aggravation and how much aggravation they cause. Well, now we can start to look at the individual barriers within each of the structural maps. And we can go through a series of quantitative scoring, and depending on where the barrier is in the map, we can start to mathematically calculate how much influence that barrier has. So the picture here in front of you, where we're looking at this barrier here, and circled it. We start off with a position score, and you find that barriers that are at the rightmost stage are assigned the lowest score. So that means a barrier down here gets a low position score, whereas a barrier that's more on the left side gets a higher position score. You then say, following on from that, how many barriers lie to the left of this particular barrier? And here we're looking at a score that signifies the number of barriers that aggravate the one we're looking at. We can continue on the scoring, and we can look to the other side and look at the number of barriers that it aggravates and give it a score for that. So we're moving towards an activity score that measures how active an item or a barrier is in receiving and dispensing aggravation. And finally, you get to a point where you have an influence score. And this influence score is the sum of its position, antecedent, succeedent activity scores. And the influence score reflects both the actual and potential influence of the barrier. And here is what these scores turned out for C for Society. This is our barrier influence map. So the figure in front of you is red from left. So we're starting here, starting left and going to the right. Unlike the structural maps that were generated at the country level, this influence barrier maps represents the paths of influence. So what we're saying then, if we look at the first stage, attitudes and awareness, this particular barrier team exerts the highest level of overall influence to a sustainable marine ecosystem. Attitudes and awareness, according to the stakeholders, are about unfounded attitudes and a lack of awareness of marine issues. According to our influence map, the next stage of influence is dictated by governance and also by knowledge. At the very end of our influence map, we have environmental concerns and sectoral issues. And this is somewhat different from the previous barriers because they have influence, but it's the lowest level of influence for a sustainable marine ecosystem. So the map that's in front of you suggests that mobilization taken in relation to stage 1 or stage 2, i.e. taken in relation to attitudes and awareness, governance, strategy, or knowledge, that they will have a stronger impact on the overall system of barriers. And not only will they have a stronger impact, but such mobilization activities could relieve some of the pressure in some of the barriers that are further on down, such as public engagement or environmental concerns. So in other words, if C for Society focus first and foremost on attitudes and awareness, we're going to get a ripple effect being felt through the system, making it somewhat easier to take actions tailored to themes such as public engagement and environmental concerns. That's not to say that you shouldn't take action at other stages of influence. So if we look here at stage 4, which is our spatial planning, we're not saying don't take immediate action here. We're saying that if an opportunity comes up, take the action around spatial planning, but know that there will be aggravating factors slowing down the effect in that area. And these aggravating factors are coming from the previous stages, such as your attitudes and your governance and your strategy. So be aware that you have a slightly higher hill to climb, so to speak. And to give you a flavor for that first most exerting level of influence, here's what the stakeholders reported when they talked about attitudes and awareness. Unfounded attitudes and lack of awareness of marine issues, considered to have the single biggest influence on a sustainable marine ecosystem. And we're saying here that in general, if circumstances and factors allow, there's likely to be greater payoff in the long run from actions taken to address some of these barriers that you see in front of you. But we also know that sometimes, because of environmental or resource considerations, we may have to start at a different point along the influence structure. So the map then says that we have a complex, dynamic, mutually interrelated set of barriers reflecting the values, knowledge, experience, and expertise that's there across all different sectors of society. Here you see some of the options that the stakeholders recommended in dealing with attitudes and awareness and the barriers there. And remember, these options had to be feasible, impactful, and timely as well. So if you were looking at a seafood festival, then you might want a mobilization objective to create a stakeholder network and marine awareness campaign, and that would also address unfounded attitudes and lack of awareness. So your take-home message here is that your C for Society attitude and awareness mobilization needs to align with these options so that the mobilization is better received by and engaged with stakeholders. We'll fast forward at this point to our citizens, and we find from the citizens' results, in 14 out of the 15 consultations, the provision of food was considered the top voted benefit. And the citizens are saying to us that it's important to bear this in mind. Whatever mobilization strategy, if it has a food or transport team, it'll be very well received by them as well. How to mobilize? How would you mobilize given this data? What would your C for Society change strategy look like? Effectively, you're looking at a portfolio of interventions. And this portfolio is at mid, down, and upstream. So you're looking at your rocking horse social marketing. You're also looking at your wild horses social marketing. And here's an example of what's actually happening. If you look at if we look here, these are very much aimed, these mobilization activities are very much aimed at your policymakers. Here we have education kicking in, and your meso level, we're looking at community initiatives and sea festivals. Almost there, last slide, saying in terms of measurement and how to manage this complex social marketing, effectively there's no one best way. It is complex, it is dynamic, it's ever changing. We have our traditional micro-level variables that we can measure and count, such as the number of commitments made, the level of knowledge. And there are new indicators emerging which reflect this wild horse scenario, such as knowledge transfer, knowledge generation, networking, and relationships. And that, ladies and gentlemen, bring us to the end of our 13th webinar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christine. That was a fascinating look at the details of how you would pull something like this together on such a huge scale. We do have a lot of questions that have come in, so let's get to those. We have some time for questions. And we'll start with one from Pierre-Yves Cousteau, who says, please elaborate on the rationale for using separate methodologies for stakeholders and citizens and youth.
Hi, Pierre. Yeah. The difference lies in the knowledge that the stakeholders and citizens youth have. The stakeholders, by definition, are experts, so they may have marine technical knowledge, scientific technical knowledge, media literacy knowledge. These are people who are working in the area and using their professional judgment and experience. Against that, the citizens and youth had more tactical knowledge, which was more your lived experiences, more what you feel, rather than being knowledgeable or experts. And because of that, the methodology is adapted to reflect that level of expertise.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah Nelson would like to know, how long did the collective intelligence process take in total, and how long was each session with the group, and did participants receive incentives for participating? And I would add to that, how were the participants recruited?
Okay, break all of this down then. Okay, the collective intelligence for the stakeholders, they were on site for 2 full days. Okay, that's the first thing. And to get them on site, and we are talking ministers, regulators, we're talking very renowned writers, newspaper writers, broadcasters, etc. You do have to incentivize them. The incentivization depended upon each country. Here in Ireland, we took them away, and Nancy will appreciate this. We took them, Nancy, to Ballymaloo House, where it was, it was a very conducive environment, huge hospitality, so that they could relax and talk and network. In other countries, for example in Norway, they took them out on one of their ships and took them away for 2 days as well. So you do have to incentivize. That is difficult, and it depends on your culture and what works. In terms of what you're asking, Tamara, then about recruiting them, we had an extensive stakeholder analysis mapping to do to identify who we should invite to these consultations. Effectively, we classified stakeholders in three different ways. You had primary stakeholders. These are individuals who are earning their economic, their wages, their salary out of marine resources. Second to that, then, were secondary stakeholders who weren't working directly with marine resources, but like restaurants and hotels, were linking into the primary users. And the final group were what we called influencers. And these were people who were involved in governance, regulation of the environment, such as media, ministers, etc.
Okay, thank you. Dave Ward is interested in the software that was used for this. He's saying, is the coding done with qualitative data software such as atlas.ti, if I'm reading that right? So if you could tell us about the software that was used for the coding.
Yeah, very, very fortunate here. I have a colleague who is in psychology, Dr. Mike Hogan, who developed up the software himself. It's interpretive structural modeling software, and it was also open source. So that was one of the things that was very important. When you're dealing with 9 or 10 different countries, 9 or 10 different languages, we needed people, not to get caught up in translation and having to put all the resources into that. And so that was the software specifically designed, developed, and written up here within NUIG.
Okay. Heather Bowen-Ray would like to know if you would recommend that all programs follow a similar barrier data mapping process, because she's trying to see how and when this type of process would apply to other social marketing efforts.
I've used it now in a number of different domains, not just the C for Society project, and colleagues have used it in other areas as well, such as mental health, antimicrobial resistance. It's a technology that works very well, or it's a methodology that's suited to a number of different situations. First situation, you've got a complex problem. And by that, we mean a problem where no one organization has the answer. So if you're dealing with complex or wicked societal difficulties, like we mentioned earlier on, smoking, obesity, then collective intelligence lends itself to that. It also lends itself to community level work. We've used it very successfully with small community groups, where we've been looking at physical activity, we've been looking at antimicrobial resistance, as I've said. It works where you have groups and there's a lot of different opinions or tensions and conflict. So we've seen this application applied in numerous other settings outside of marketing and outside of behavioral change. And it works well there too. It works if you're looking at things from an ecosystem perspective. If you're taking a systems perspective, then this is a good methodology as well.
Okay, thank you. Karen Ginsberg says that she didn't understand the difference between attitudes and awareness in stage 1, all the way at the left of that phase diagram, versus the public engagement, which was farther on the right.
Yeah.
So if you could explain that more.
What emerged was very much these kind of strange, and the stakeholders used the word unfounded. It was very, it was like, it doesn't matter if we dump rubbish into the sea, it's okay. And it was like, just because you can't see the plastic in the sea doesn't make it okay. So there were these kind of strange understandings around the sea and the role that it plays in our life. And then even when you had a situation where somebody appreciated how much the seas contribute to humankind, then it was, well, I know how important they are, but they still didn't care. So you had this lack of a caring attitude. And that lack of a caring attitude blocked people from undertaking sustainable behavioral actions in relation to the sea. The public engagement was you could offer a free sea festival and people were saying, well, I don't care, and they don't turn up. So even if you were running events and they were free, people still weren't engaging. So that's the difference. One was very much to do with this, I don't care about the sea, and the other then was, not only do I not care, I'm not even going to do anything about not caring. It was the action part.
Okay, and I don't know if we'll have time for it. I'll try and squeeze it in. Christine, if you could keep the answer as short as possible. Pierre-Yves Cousteau would like to know, he just says, can you please say a word about sample size, statistical significance, extrapolation of the data to all stakeholders and citizens on the national, regional, EU level? If you could answer that in 30 seconds, I think that would be great.
We did not use probability sampling. So, statistically, I can't stand over the data and say I'm 95% confident of the results that are here, because we used judgmental non-probability data. However, given the patterns and the trends and the similarities that were emerging from the 16 different consultations, and the similarities of words used by the stakeholders and the citizens, it would go a long way to say we're on the right path.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today for questions. And thank you to everyone who asked questions and was engaged in the process. And Christine, huge thanks to you. This has been a fascinating and interesting presentation. And thank you for encouraging us to look at the wild horse model of social marketing as well as the traditional rocking horse model and how they can work together to tackle today's complex issues. It was really helpful to see how the collective intelligence process was laid out from consultation with stakeholders all the way to mobilization in such a large-scale initiative as C4Society. This has been very valuable. You've given us lots to think about and talk about. Thank you for sharing your experiences and expertise. If anyone has further questions for Christine, her email is available and you will be able to get in touch with her afterwards yourselves. And I'll just hand it over to Jay.
Oh, well, I don't know if there's anything else I wanted to say at this point. I'm
sorry. Maybe it's Win. Okay.
Okay, I'll just remind you. Thank you. If you have, we ask you to fill out an evaluation form that will come up on your screen after you log out of the webinar. Please do fill it out and let it help us make future webinars even better for you. Do you like the length? Is the time of day okay for you? How do you like the topics? Is the format good for you? And I'll skip that as we're running out of time. But I would say, Tamara and Jay, it's been a pleasure to be part of the webinar today. You make it seem easy, but I know that you spend a lot of time organizing this program, and we all really appreciate it. And Christine, thank you for your glimpse into what I'm calling now Wild Horses Social Marketing. That's great, great moniker. Connecting individual behavior change to far-reaching social change. I've certainly taken away a lot of things that I'm going to try to apply in future, and I look forward to hearing more about the work that you're doing in future. I hope we can have you back for another webinar in our future webinar series to let us know what else you're doing with this advance in social marketing. Last but not least, to our members and our participants today in today's webinar, thank you for your continued support and your participation. We hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be Behavior Change at Your Fingertips, Social Marketing's Use of Smartphone Apps and SMS. And that will be presented by Rebecca Russell Bennett in Australia on July 23rd and 24th, 2015. Until then, keep visiting our ISMA website, share your events on our calendar, exchange resources, keep up with our Career Center. And until then, this is the International Social Marketing Association. We now conclude today's webinar.